Well, hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to be engaging with the subject of whether or not church services are all planned out and whether that's a good thing or whether that's a bad thing.
Did you know that when you go to church, everything is planned and staged? From the moment you drive onto the property, you're being manipulated. Why do you think
Now, first of all, there's no the most polished church in the world. This is obviously an overstatement that everything is planned and staged, but she's making a wide claim about this. And the interesting thing is that it seems like she's equating the idea of something being planned with you being manipulated, and that's something that's going to come up later. Those are not necessarily the same thing. Having intentionality in communication or plan does not mean that it's this nefarious manipulation.
Why do you think they're holding signs in the parking lot telling you that you're family when they've never met you? And the happy, shiny people that are greeting you at the door, they're trained. And if you're a first-time guest, you're going to get swag, you're going to get gift cards, maybe even free coffee from the church cafe. Then there's
So I think one of my favorite parts is her just talking about the idea that those greeters, they've been trained. As if that's clearly that this is going to be some shocking revelation to people that's going to completely change their view of things. But for me, I'm sort of like, yeah, of course they've been trained. Wouldn't we want anybody that's participating in any role, that's serving in any way or leading in any way, that there's been some training that's gone into it? That there is, again, in her sort of this line through this, that any sense of sort of planning or forethought is bad, and that I guess the good would just be if everything was purely spontaneous, maybe like if we didn't even have greeters, but if people just showed up and were sort of just doing things, or if we did assign greeters, at the very least, we didn't give them any guidance on, hey, here's your job and here's what we're hoping for you to do, but just allowed them to do their thing. If we didn't have smiling people in the parking lot trying to welcome others and make them feel like they belong. She talks about the idea of people trying to make you feel like you belong. That's a prayer that we have every week as we're getting ready for Sunday morning, that people would come and that they would feel like they belong. So there is a through line here of her just thinking any sort of training or intentionality is nefarious and manipulative.
There's the pre-service music, the countdown, the worship set, the transitions, the announcements, the offering, the message, the altar call, the dismissal, and your exit. All planned. I was on a worship team and we had a green room. And we were told to not stay in the green room before the service and in between services, but to go into the lobby and talk to people to make people feel connected. So
this is, it's strange to me. I'm not sure if she has had experiences where when she's talked about this stuff, people have been really alarmed by it. She's going to talk about some stuff later on that I think is concerning, but I mean, talking about the idea, we have a green room also, and for me, the green room can be really helpful if you're involved in. We have all three services, because it is tiring for the people that are on stage. So it is helpful to have that there. But I try to spend very little time in there. I'm always out between services. So it's strange that the idea of that they're trying to make you feel connected to them. For me, especially when I'm given the sermon, I absolutely am wanting people to feel connected to me. I learned early on in ministry that if people have engaged with me and feel like I care about them, which I do, I'm not manipulating, and feel like they're important to me, and that if we were having a conversation that they'd be listened to and that they'd be treated as important, they're much more likely to listen to me when I'm given a sermon than if somebody has never had an interaction with me. And again, you could look at that and you could say, well, Dan, you're manipulating them into listening to you. I'm like, well, I'm trying to get people to experience the hope and the new life in Jesus. And if me being personable with people is going to break down a barrier, I'm like, of course I'm going to do that. It's not insincere. It's not me pretending or me trying to get them to do something that would be bad for them. It's so again, I just don't know what her experience is. If these have been bombshells to people and they found out, oh my goodness, I can't believe that they told you to get out of the green room and go connect with people. It just seems like a very normal thing that people would think is a normal thing to do.
But when they see you on the stage, they can relate to you. And to make sure that worship set is clean and there's no hiccups, we've already done a run through. We've already practiced the entire set several times.
I would just be surprised if anybody doesn't know that. I mean, music, like doing music is difficult. And anyway, it's an amazing skill set. Doing music as a team, the idea that people would say, wait a second, you've practiced this? I'm like, of course they've practiced this. How can you function together as a team unless you've practiced? So again, this just seems like this seems like a very strange thing to see as, maybe it seems strange to me that she sees this as strange. I would be surprised if anybody came up and asked me, well, does the worship team practice? I would say, oh yeah, like they do several run-throughs to make sure that they're in sync with each other. And I just can't imagine anybody saying like, gosh, I have a real problem with the idea that they're practicing.
One time I was doing a special song after the message, and during the run-through, the lead pastor was watching me to make sure that I was doing it the way he wanted. And it wasn't even a worship song, it was a song to be performed. So I was sitting on a stool and I had my eyes open. And so he comes over and tells me, you need to close your eyes so that people are feeling the moment. And so I did, and it gave the vibe that he wanted.
So I'll say this is the first thing that she said in this entire video that I would look at, and I don't know the situation. I don't know what really went down. I don't feel like her presentation gives me a lot of confidence that I would think what she's saying is precisely what happened. But let's say it was. Let's say that's exactly what happened. I would see that as like, yeah, that's not great. That's not a good thing to do. That does feel a bit more manipulative and sort of specific in everything. I will say this on the other side. We had a member of a worship team when I was living up in Oregon. And one of the things that the worship leaders of the team consistently tried to communicate to him was, hey, like when you're playing, like, can you smile? They were like, not in some way that they were trying to be fake, but they were like, that we're worshiping the Lord. We're looking to invite people into something that's joyful. Like, do you think you could just like smile when you're doing this? And he actually had a real issue with it and felt like they were asking him to be fake. And they were sort of like, I don't know, like, is it fake to smile when you're joyously worshiping the Lord? Like we're just communicating to you that your face communicates something to the people who are watching you. And this is something that when I'm preaching, I'm very aware of, to think of, gosh, my posture, my body language, my face is communicating to somebody, is communicating to people about how they're meant to respond to things. So I think broadly speaking, something like that is all right. I would say I would never do what she's saying her pastor did. And if somebody else was sort of advising somebody to do that, I would say, let's not do that. That does feel manipulative to me. If he was simply saying like, hey, like just be aware of your facial expressions, because those things are a part of what's inviting people in, I would say that's absolutely fine. But if it's like, close your eyes because that's the vibe we want, this would be the first point where I would agree with her and say, I don't think that was a good choice.
During worship sets, worship leaders are told whether they can say something, when they can say it, and how long they have to say it.
So broadly speaking, like, yes, that is true. If churches have a worship service, and especially if it's something where it is sort of like time sensitive, like we have 3 services on Sunday, not because we want to have 3 services, but because we can't house everybody in one. We would love to just have everybody in one service, and there would be a lot of freedom that would go along with that. But because of just the practical demands, we have a limited amount of time. And so we look to very purposefully budget our time. And so I don't go to Andy, our worship pastor, and tell him you can say something or you don't. But he knows he has a certain amount of time. And so if he wants to say, all right, there's this part where I want to read a verse or I want to give an encouragement, he budgets that into his time. In the same way that with the sermon, I budget things into my time, which doesn't mean there's nothing spontaneous, but means I don't have the freedom to just do whatever I want. We're all a part of a team. So broadly speaking, what she's saying is true. I think most worship pastors aren't told exactly what they're allowed to say or whether they're allowed to say something, but they're working within a time constraint for the worship service that most churches are working within.
And the pastors have rehearsed their sermon like a speech.
Most have not, or most have not rehearsed. Yes, but yes, it's true. The rumors are true that pastors do practice and look to be ready to speak because speaking is difficult and because we want to do a good job.
Even down to the pause when they're going to get emotional.
Now that is false that most pastors do that. I'm sure that there are some who do that. That is absolutely untrue, that's a common thing, that pastors are sort of to that degree. First of all, pastors are busy just like everyone else. There's a certain amount of luxury that would go into that sort of preparation just time-wise. So like on Thursdays, I actually, when I'm preaching, I give, we call it our sermon preview. I give wherever I'm at in the sermon prep that time, I present it to 4 members of our staff to get feedback, because in the past I was getting feedback after my sermons, which was helpful, but I was like, I wish I would have known this before. So I give a version of the sermon on Thursdays, get some advanced feedback. It's incredibly helpful. What never has happened, what nobody has ever said is, hey, at that point, pause and act like you're emotional. And that's something that I've never done. So I'm sure there's a pastor who does that. Maybe she interacted with one who did. It is absolutely false that most pastors do that. Most pastors don't have the luxury of that sort of figuring out every beat of their sermon.
All of it is structured to emotionally manipulate you and make you feel like you belong. Because if you feel like you belong, you'll be more willing to serve or to give free labor. And you'll be loyal and you'll invite your friends and continue the cycle. And all of this for one reason: money, baby.
So this is obviously incredibly cynical. And the difficult thing is that, of course, there have been churches that have been about the money. I mean, there are churches that in some ways don't even seem to hide it very much, the more prosperity theology churches. And then there's some other churches that you could look at that are probably larger in scale, that at least there's some temptation in that direction, or there's been some scandal concerning money. So this does happen. This does happen, that money can be a driving factor and can be a temptation. You know, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, all of that sort of thing. For her to sort of reduce, first of all, the idea of, hey, if you belong, you give free labor, sort of like you serve, or she just equates that of like, hey, they're just trying to get you to sort of serve them and give them free labor so that they don't have to employ people and so that you'll give them money. One of the tricky things in our culture, because we're a very transactional culture in the United States, is that this can be something that happens sort of on both sides of a church, where churches feel like, all right, we're giving, or church leaderships, I should say, can feel like, all right, we're giving people a product, and if we give them that product, they will serve and they will give, and we can keep this thing going. And it's sort of like they're the customer. If they're unhappy with something, we'll change it. So to some degree, every church wrestles with this. So what she's saying is not like 100% untrue, but for her to speak and behave as if this is just the driving force of every church is just absolute silliness. I mean, this is just absolutely untrue. But she believes that if there's intentionality, if there's thought in this, then people are trying to manipulate you into believing that you belong. And again, I'd say, I want everybody who shows up to in one form or another to feel like they belong. If they're believers, I want them to know that they belong to God, they belong to us, they're brothers and sisters in Christ. If they're not believers, I want them to feel like they belong in the sense that they're showing up and they say, these people care about me and are willing to help me in any way that they can, and they're glad that I'm here. So absolutely, but it's almost as if she can't imagine that there would be intentionality from a church saying, we want to do all that we can to make people feel loved and cared for and like they belong, because that will put them in a position where they might be more responsive to Jesus, which is what we want. Instead, to her, the only possible motivation for this would be because we just want to get their money and we just want to get them to give us some free labor. So it's sad. I don't know what all led to her being so cynical about this, but being purposeful in our lives, planning, including planning a worship service and planning the greeters and planning what we're going to do if somebody who's a first-time guest shows up, those things are not things that we need to be afraid of. Us being purposeful with the opportunities that God has given us is a great thing for us to do. And we don't hide the fact that we do plan things and we're very purposeful about what we do. And I think it's good for churches to do that.